Hi, welcome back. So we ended last time with completing the discussion of Rushui, Confucianism. Of course, we didn't get to everything, but one can't get to everything. So I had said that we turn immediately to Dàoism in this lecture, but I decided I'd go briefly to legalism and Mòism before turning to Dàoism. I've talked a bit about legalism thus far. I won't add a whole lot to that, and I'm only going to talk about Mòism briefly. But I thought it would be better to go through that a little before turning to Dàoism. Legalism, Mòism, and indeed Dàoism all differ from Rushui in a number of respects, some of which they share. For example, all three of them, in one way or another, distance themselves from or object to or set up principles that run contrary to the Rushui Confucian preference for family. You remember in the one exchange where Kongzi is visiting another realm and is told of a person that the speaker thinks of as exemplary because this person's father had done something illegal and the person turned his father into the police, reported his father for illegal activity. And Kongzi was appalled that a son would behave that way toward a father, or indeed that a father would have behaved that way toward a son. That preference for kin over larger groups, over others, was something that all three of these schools rejected from Rushui. I'm first going to say a few words about Mòism. It's the doctrine associated with Mozi. Again, Tzu just means master, so it's Master Mo. There are a number of things that Mozi argued. For example, he was very insistent on pragmatism, on doing things that helped people in their concrete daily lives. That's, as you can imagine, I'm all in favor of that. I'm more than sympathetic toward it. I'm very, I think it's a good thing. But Mozi took it to an extreme that I think most of us would find problematic. So, for example, he didn't see any practical benefit in music. And so he did object to music. In that respect, he differentiated himself from Kongzi as well, since Kongzi always advocated music as indeed a beneficial means, an effective means of inculcating virtue. And as I mentioned last time, I'm not sure I really understand why he thinks that, but I'm, as I imagine you are also, I am much more sympathetic with liking music than not. So But there are two views of Mozi that I want to emphasize and that have been influential and that he's widely cited for. One is his opposition to war. Again, this comes during the Warring States period, after the Spring and Autumn period, both of which are seriously disrupted periods of severe social disruption due to social fragmentation, dissolution of larger political units, and the development of continual warfare among these units, these fragments of former societies. Again, this was ended by the Qin dynasty and its unification of China that we've talked about. Okay, so Mozi was very devoted to trying to end specifically offensive war, one kingdom attacking another. He recognized that when you're attacked, you have to defend yourself, and he actually tried to devise strategies for defensive warfare that would minimize the killing and maiming and trauma of warfare. And he traveled meeting rulers and governmental officials from various societies, trying to convince them to abandon offensive war and to adopt only defensive techniques when faced with the necessity of responding to an attack from enemies. You can find this in, again, like the Mengzi, the text, the fundamental text of Moism is called the Mozi, and you can find, and that's on C-text, and you can find the discussion, the opposition to offensive war, and his advocacy of defensive war when needed in Book 5 of that volume. Today I want to look at briefly at just one part of the Mozi, dealing with the other main theme that I want to point out to you, and that's the theme of universal love. What Mozi is most famous for, his insistence that in an ideal society, you don't treat people preferentially because they're part of your family or part of your network of friends, or they're like you in their profession or in their political attitudes or in their religious affiliation. We would extend that to racial groups. And indeed, that's possible in China too, where historically there have been socially marked distinctions between the majority Han population and others, and other groups. The Xiongnu, for example, that will turn up as an alien group in some of the literature. I think they turn up in some of the plays we're looking at later on. Certainly it turns up with the Mongols, the Han-Mongol relation, and to a lesser extent, Han-Manchurian relations in the Yuan dynasty and the Ming dynasty. which again we'll get to later. Okay, so I just want to give you a taste of the sort of thing that Moats address. So go to Mòism, book 4, section 3. Oh, sorry, I lost that. Universal love. We want section 3. No, section 3. All right. Okay, so let me make this a little bigger so it's more legible. I'll just read these to you. I think they merit explication, but I'm not going to use time to explicate them. Moats said, the purpose of the magnanimous, that is somebody who is generous and benevolent in spirit, lies in procuring benefits for the world and eliminating its calamities. Notice that the universalism he's about to argue for, in effect, already enters in his formulation of what the fundamental social goal is. It's producing benefits for the world, not for one's society, not for the nation. Now, among all the current calamities, which is the most important? The attack on the small states by the large ones, disturbances of the small houses by the large ones. This is families, subgroups in society. So first there are nations attacking one another, then there are subgroups within a nation attacking one another. Oppression of the weak by the strong. This is what happens within subgroups. Misuse of the few by the many. Deception of the simple by the cunning. Disdain toward the humble by the honored. These are the misfortunes in the empire. Again, the lack of grace on the part of the ruler, the lack of loyalty on the part of the minister, the lack of affection on the part of the father, the lack of filial piety on the part of the son. These are further calamities in the empire. So these are the sorts of things. Note that he's listed a series of problems in society. And he's gone from the larger problems in society, in the world, warfare between states, to the more local subgroups within society, to the still more constrained, the family. And this way he's following that standard format that we've seen a couple of times in connection with Rushui teaching. But he's going to address their relation differently. Instead of grounding everything on the familial relation, as you find in Rushui, he's going to advocate something else. Let's see. Okay. Also, the mutual injury and harm which the unscrupulous do to one another with weapons, poison, water, and fire is still another calamity in the empire. When we come to think about the cause of all these calamities, how have they arisen? Have they arisen out of the love of others and benefiting others? Of course, we should say no. We should say that they have arisen out of hate of others and injuring others. We should classify one by one all those who hate others and injure others. If we should classify one by one all those who hate others and injure others, should we find them to be universal in love or partial? So note that what he's doing here is implicitly arguing against the idea we found in Rushui, that the root of the problem of disintegration, of mistreatment, conflict, oppression in society, the root of that, according to Confucianism, Rushui, it's some sort of misalignment in oneself and one's relation to the world, but that works its way out in a disintegration of the family. And so for Kongzi, somebody who does not honor his or her father, somebody who turns the father in, for example, to the state, somebody who doesn't show what Kongzi considers appropriate preference for his or her own family, is actually contributing by not being preferential, not being partial to one's family. That person is actually contributing to social disintegration or social opposition, social problems, the sorts of problems listed here. But what Mòism says is, okay, let's look at these things. Is the problem here that people aren't loyal enough to their own families? And so on. Is it that they're not partial enough? Well, if we ask in a disintegrated, a conflicted, and oppressive society about people, what do we find about the way people are behaving in this dystopian society? Again, when we come to think about the causes of all these calamities, how have they arisen? Have they arisen out of love of others and benefiting others? Of course, we should say no. We should say they have arisen out of hate of others and injuring others. If we should classify one by one all those who hate others and injure others, should we find them to be universal in love or partial? Of course, we should say they are partial. Now, since partiality against another is the cause of the major calamities in the empire, then it is wrong. So it's exactly the sort of preference for family, for parents especially, or offspring, exactly the sort of thing that's emphasized in Rushui that Mòism says it gets things completely backwards. Mòism continued, whoever criticizes others must have something to replace them. Criticism without suggestion is like trying to stop flood with flood and put out the fire with fire. It will surely be without worth. Mòism said, partiality is to be replaced by universality. But how is it that partiality can be replaced by universality? Now, when everyone regards the states of others as he regards his own, who would attack others' states? So you eliminate nationalism. You are as respectful and fond of other nations as of your own. And if you are, you're not going to advocate invading those other nations and harming the people there. Others are regarded like self. When everyone regards the capitals of others as he regards his own, who would seize the other's capitals? Others are regarded like self. When everyone regards the houses of others as he regards his own, who would disturb others' houses? Others are regarded like self. Now, when the states and cities do not attack and seize each other, and when the clans and individuals do not disturb and harm one another, is this a calamity or a benefit to the world? Of course, it is a benefit. When we come to think about the several benefits in regard to their cause, how have they arisen? Have they arisen out of hate of others and injuring others? Of course, we should say no. We should say they have arisen out of love of others and benefiting others. If we should classify one by one all those who love others and who benefit others, should we find them to be partial or universal? Of course, we should say they are universal. Now, since universal love is the cause of the major benefits in the world, thereby Mozi proclaims universal love is right. And as has already been said, the interest of the magnanimous lies in procuring benefits for the world and eliminating its calamities. Now that we have found out the consequences of universal love to be the major benefits of the world, and the consequences of partiality to be the major calamities in the world, this is the reason why Mozi said partiality is wrong and universality is right. He goes on to respond to objections. I had actually intended to read a little more of this, but I see we've already gone more than 20 minutes, so I think I better pause, I better stop on Mozi. You might want to read this, just this little fourth segment here, just to get a little further idea of what Mozi is up to. So that's Mozi. Or a little taste of Mozi. Another very influential school of thought was, again, legalism, Fa, which I mentioned a number of times. Again, it's a philosophy. It's clear that some of the basic ideas had been around for a long time, because there are aspects of the Analects, that certainly appear to respond to legalist doctrines, even though legalism itself wasn't officially formulated until the Warring States period. And again, that followed the spring and autumn period in which Kongzi was writing and the Analects were presumably produced. So some of the basic ideas seem to have been in circulation earlier, but it was in its official formulation. It was led by a few writers. These included Han Feizi and Sule, two students, as I mentioned, of Xunzi. And you can see how the skepticism that Xunzi felt with regard to human nature, his pessimistic, negative attitude toward human nature could, depending on who was working on it, who was developing it, could easily develop into something like legalism. Anyway, as I mentioned before, legalism was very harsh. It was completely opposed to the idea of Kongzi that you don't treat people with punishments, you don't guide the society with punishment, you guide the society with benevolence and propriety. And if the leaders of the society are behaving ethically, virtuously, then the ordinary people will follow. And that's exactly the opposite of what the legalists say. They basically say you have to keep people in line. You have to be strict, indeed very harsh with people. And so Han, for example, H-A-N, F-E-I-Z-I is the second name, which is actually the given name. Han is the family name. As you know, it's standard in China for the family name to go first and the given name to go second, rather than the way European societies generally do it, with the given name first and the family name second. So Han Feizi, so is again a particle of respect, as it's called. Han Feizi, other discrepancies with Rushui with Kongzi include, you may remember we read a passage last time where Kongzi said that when a subordinate commits a minor infraction, you should be forgiving. You should understand their human failings. The implication was understand their human failings, hold up a model for them to follow, but don't be overly strict. Be empathic, be forgiving. Again, Shu can refer to either forgiveness or empathy, and the two concepts are related in Kongzi. Han Feizi actually says in the Han Feizi, that's the text expressing his, it's a central text in legalism expressing his views. And Han Feizi actually says, no, it's crucial that you harshly punish small offenses, because that's the way that you prevent people from engaging in big offenses. You really strike them hard when they commit even minor infractions, and then in his view they won't even consider, there's no possibility that they'll approach the major crimes. So it's a very harsh approach. And not another thing that one aspect that shows its harshness is its common advocacy, its regular advocacy of collective punishment. So if someone one of your children commits a crime, it's likely that you'll be punished for the crime as well as the child, because even if the child is 30 years old, if someone in your work group commits a crime, there's a good chance you and the other members of the work group will be punished for it. And the idea here is that if you make everybody responsible for the crimes of everybody, then that will encourage them to prevent one another from committing crimes and to turn others in when they do commit crimes, and thus leading to swifter retribution, and in the theory, in the legalist theory, less extensive damage from the crime. In this regard, it actually takes up a long-standing practice. Legalism takes up a long-standing practice of what's called destroying the lineage, a practice that we'll see in one of the UN dramas we will discuss later in the semester. This is the practice of killing not only if you're in conflict with a person and you fight them and kill them, you might go so far as to kill the entire lineage, principally as a way of preventing a cycle of revenge killings. And that's the way it's represented in the Orphan of Dao, the Dao Orphan. an important UN play that we'll be reading later in the semester. This also in the past, prior to the development of legalism, was seen as a mode of punishment for particularly harsh crimes. So, for example, if someone in your family led a rebellion against the monarch, then you, even though you were loyal to the monarch, you and all of your other kin might be exterminated also due to this practice of destroying the lineage. This is part of a general legalist view that individuals are all responsible for the legal violations in their group. One thing, however, that is, so I'm guessing that a lot of you share my distaste for many of these legalist practices, and indeed when they were instituted rigorously and officially in the short-lived Qin dynasty, the people who lived under them objected to them, rejected them, and they were just enormously unpopular. And they were seen, their cruelty was seen as contributing to the loss of the Tianming, the mandate of heaven, the swift loss of the mandate of heaven by the Qing dynasty, and their replacement by the very long-lived Han dynasty. And indeed, when the new Han emperor became emperor, one of the first things he did was announce the end of legal practices. However, basically what happened in the history of China is that legalist ideas and practices have continued to, off and on, continued to be very influential, sometimes having great impact on governments and legal systems, though rarely invoked as such. Only in rare instances have people actually, has anyone actually praised legalism, even though it's influential, adopted by many governments that you can see as you read the history of China. Versions of legalism are very much present in a number of governments, but it's rarely admitted as such. One of the few exceptions to that was during the anti-Confucius campaign in the 1970s in China, during the Mao period. Okay. So I'm sure you share with me some of the distaste for this, but one thing that was very beneficial in it was its emphasis on equality before the law. And the legalists were particularly insistent on opposition to any form of favoritism, so that harsh punishments would be applied not only to the peasantry but to the aristocrats, not only to the people accused of crimes, but to the judges and the police as well, so that a criminal investigator who was found to have behaved not in accordance with the law, to have violated laws, was himself as likely to be executed as one of the accused that he was investigating. So this complete equality before the law is very striking. And as you can imagine, judges, for example, were accountable for false accusations. It had complicated results that I don't really have time to go into. It was a good thing in principle to hold criminal investigators to the same legal standards, and often worked out well. But in such things as, for example, torture, it probably, at least in some cases, encouraged torture because the criminal investigator would be guilty of a crime if he was found to have tortured an innocent person. And one of the main ways they decided if a person was innocent is whether he confessed or not. So a criminal investigator who tortured somebody and in the course of torturing them became convinced that they didn't actually commit the crime would have encouragement from the legal system to torture the person even more brutally to elicit a false confession, because otherwise the criminal investigator himself would probably be executed. So it had mixed results, but I think most of us would agree that in principle the idea of equality before the law was a good thing about legalism. You also, again, I've taken too much time with this, so I'm not going to go into details, but Han Feizi responds directly to Kongtse's anecdote about not turning in your father to the law, and says, no, that's got it backwards. If your father commits a crime, you've got to turn him in. This is, again, an explicit and significant difference between the two, which is part of the legalist opposition to familial partiality in Rushui. Okay, I was going to read through some passages, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to not do that just because, again, I always take longer than I anticipate. And so we should get to at least some of the Dàoism today. Okay, where is my cursor? Excuse me. Okay, so now we're going to turn to the Dàodéjīng. As you can see, I've put the little symbol of yin-yang over on the right part of the screen there, and I'll return to that in a moment. So Dàoism is traditionally traced to the text sometimes referred to as the Laozi, sometimes referred to as the Dàodéjīng. Laozi means the old master. And it's not entirely clear to me or to many other readers that the text indeed had one author. It seems very likely that it is a compilation of wisdom that was associated with a particular mystical tradition of philosophical thought and spiritual practice and that was compiled again in the spring and autumn period, associated with the name Lao Tzu. But perhaps Lao Tzu did indeed refer to an individual who had responsibility for some of what is in the text as it's come down to us, but that is presumably not an individual who authored the whole text. On the other hand, sort of folklorically, he's treated as such an individual, and indeed is seen as having sort of, in Taoist tradition, is seen as having a sort of the spiritual superiority to Kongzi, and having been roughly contemporary with him. Dàodéjīng would mean the classic, even though it's not often classed as one of the classics. It's not one of the Confucian classics, I guess, for obvious reasons. Dao, as you know, means the way. De means virtue or power. And both of those meanings are important. We'll turn to them in a moment. The text is organized so that about half of it addresses the idea of the Tao, and about half of it addresses the idea of the De. But they are complementary. You don't have one without the other. They're different aspects of the same thing. That sort of unity within differentiation is perhaps the most common rhetorical way of framing philosophical issues in Taoism, and is represented by the image of the yin-yang forming one whole. And as the image suggests, it sort of suggests a sort of circular movement, these figures going around in circles, in effect, each one turning into the other. Now, in terms of the long-standing tradition that the book is drawing on, for a long while, in ancient times, this was referred to as the Huang Lao Shui, the teaching of the Yellow Emperor and the Old Master. And again, you remember the Yellow Emperor was the mythical founder of China, inventor of script, pottery, and other things. The sort of demiurge kind of figure who created civilization, in effect, in China. Lao Tzu is paired with him as this sort of primordial, philosophical, mystical thinker. And that primordiality is also centrally important to the text, Dàodéjīng, and the tradition that followed through the history of Taoism for the next 2,500 years or so. One way Wing Tzu Chan, a Western academic philosopher writing on China, editor of, for example, of the valuable source book in Chinese philosophy, and not just editor, but author of the commentary that accompanies the texts in that very useful volume. He says that the relation between Tao and De is that Dao is the, so to speak, the general structure. It's the universal principle of nature. Virtue, but also power, and again we'll return to that. Virtue and power are the manifestation of this overarching nature, of this basic principle of life, or not even of life, it's even broader than life because it covers the inanimate world also. The relation between that and its particularization in a specific life, in in what an actual person does from moment to moment, from day to day, from year to year, throughout life and beyond life. If one becomes an immortal, for example, which was an aspiration of Taoists in some of their sort of more magically oriented, in some of its more magically oriented strains. That's one of the reasons why Da is not only virtue but power, because there was an idea that following the way not only was virtuous, not only did it mean manifesting natural virtue, it also meant that you could achieve, you could do things supernaturally. You could achieve immortality. You could, as an immortal, you could engage in superhuman feats of movement and transformation of the world through thought rather than through physical interaction with the world and so on. Both ideas, the Dao and the De, I've just been speaking of them in relation to individual lives, and that's an important part of the Dàodéjīng. But another important part, you won't be surprised to hear from everything we've talked about in connection with Kongzi, another important part is its relation to governance, to society as a whole, to civic relations, to the organization, the structure of bureaucracy or a legal system or whatever. And now, as you remember, Rushui was very concerned with pragmatic aspects of what rulers do, what administrators do, and so on. There's a very different view of what they should do in legalism, but it was also very practically oriented in terms of what people should do. In specific areas, Mòism was also in the area of warfare, for example. Sort of in opposition to all of this, emphasis on positive actions to develop a beneficent and effective state. An ideal, or to approach as closely to an ideal social structure as possible. In sort of opposition to all of these positive prescriptions for that, such as the legalists' insistence on strict laws and harsh punishments, or Kongzi's insistence on the value, the necessity of right behavior, virtuous behavior by the leaders of society. In opposition to all of that, you have the central principle the central Taoist principle articulated in the Dàodéjīng as Wu Wei, non-action, non-doing. So you repeatedly find in Lao Tzu the idea that the admirable emperor, for example, the admirable king, refrains from action. Instead of doing stuff, resists doing stuff. It's really hard to figure out what this means. There are passages that we might get to where it seems that he's not saying, that the text is not saying that the leader should actually do nothing, but is rather saying that the leader should appear to do nothing and should, in effect, conceal his or her actions, his or her interventions in society, should do them covertly, should conceal them so that people aren't aware that he or she is manipulating social relations and so on. There are a few passages like that, but most of the time it seems that he's saying you really should not do anything. And so what does this mean? Sometimes it's interpreted to mean that you should have a sort of extreme laissez-faire government, a government that doesn't enter into the economy at all. So as you know, as you remember, I've mentioned that a number of governments in China for millennia have taken control of key resources, key commodities, precious metals, for example, or industrial metals, iron, tea, whatever, things that are that give rise to or extend expand the economy, things that are items that are widely traded, items that are part of the generation of wealth in society. It is recurring. There are recurring instances of the government taking control of those key commodities. There are recurring instances of the government engaging in land reform, redistributing land. So there are many cases, and you remember Meng Tzu advocating land reform. So there are many cases in Chinese history where rulers are taking an active role in the economy of the state. And one way of interpreting Wu Wei is that they shouldn't do that they should let the economy alone, that they should not interfere. That, again, like the first interpretation I gave, that they should act but conceal it, the laissez-faire interpretation is consistent with some passages in the text, but not consistent with others. So that a number of passages, for example, one of the passages we'll probably get to, both advocates doing nothing and advocates keeping the people well fed, making sure the people are well fed. Well, it's not obvious how a government could make sure that the people are well fed and not intervene in the economy at all. It seems that keeping them well fed would involve intervening in the economy. So, so that doesn't necessarily seem to fit. Again, it fits sometimes, but not always. Another interpretation is basically that if you follow the Tao, you won't rule at all. you shouldn't really be part of society. If you read the Mengzi, you'll see that Mengzi advocates several things that lower level officials should do. One thing they should do if their superiors, if say the emperor or the king is behaving in an unvirtuous way, in an inhumane, a non-benevolent way, is not following propriety. There are several things that subordinate officials can do. In certain cases, in all cases, the subordinate officials should admonish the ruler to behave virtuously. That's true across the board for Mengzi and for Kongzi. Mengzi goes on to say that in some cases, subordinate officials, if the ruler is recalcitrant and doesn't mend his or her ways, doesn't behave properly, in some cases, the subordinate official may take this to indicate that the mandate of heaven has been lost and that revolution, an overthrow of the ruler is not only legitimate but perhaps even required. There are some cases like that. In other cases, however, he says that if your admonitions, if you remonstrate with the ruler and he ignores you repeatedly and there's nothing else for you to do, then you should withdraw from service. Retreat from governance. No longer participate in this unvirtuous social structure. One way of interpreting Wu Wei is that basically you should always withdraw, that the only way to follow the Tao is to completely isolate yourself from the corrupting influences of civilization, principally by a return to nature. And you get this in some of the poetry, the Taoist influenced poetry, with poets who leave sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily, leave government service and retreat to the countryside, living in nature and nature in the sense of trees and rivers and so on. So living in nature and thus coming, regaining, rediscovering, reviving their contact with nature in the sense of their ultimate self and their ultimate purpose in the Tao. So these two natures, these two senses of nature, a nature in the sense of greenery, non-civilization, and nature in the sense of the primordial orientation of the self and of the universe. These two senses are joined in this retreat to nature orientation. And again, this fits, in my view, this probably fits more passages in the text than the other interpretations, but it clearly doesn't fit a number of them, which do give advice on how to deal with subordinates, clearly suggesting that the ruler has obligations that he or she should fulfill. In connection with this retreat to nature, there's a kind of what we would, in the United States, after like the 1960s, there's an element of what we might refer to as counterculture in Dàoism. It's retreat to nature. It's association, as you'll see in the poet Li Bai, one of the generally considered one of the two greatest poets in Chinese history. The other being Du Fu, who was a Confucian. And then there's a third who's sometimes named Wang Wei, who was a Buddhist. So you have each of these three major philosophical orientations represented. But anyway, as you'll see when you read Li Bai, excuse me, Taoism is often associated with intoxicants. Li Bai was drank a lot and wrote poetry about drinking. This emphasis on individual freedom, what in the 1960s was calling dropping out of the rat race or out of the corporate culture. These are recurring themes in Taoism, and there's this sort of countercultural element to it. One of the writers on Taoism, D.C. Lau, points to an early well, not necessarily pre-Taoist, but pre-Dàodéjīng school of egoism, somewhat similar to Epicureanism in the West, from the best known from the Warring States period, but preceding that in its tradition. It emphasized sort of celebrating the self, again in a very non-roushui manner, focusing on, as I say, celebrating the self. I know that sounds vague, but again, when you read Li Bai, you'll get a better sense of what I mean. It sounds as if it would be offensive, but it isn't actually. It's because he celebrates himself and his relation to the transcendental Tao and the way he himself manifests the absolute. And it isn't offensive because, he agrees that we all manifest the absolute also. So it's just this great celebration of being the absolute. And it's very different from celebrating how much you defer to your parents in filial piety or something. So, and that is again part of Wu Wei. Wu Wei, in my opinion, the basic thing that it means is, the key thing that it means is none of these specific interpretations that I've gone through. It fundamentally means don't go against your nature. Follow your nature. So you're not doing anything. You're just letting the Tao act through you. And when you let the Tao act through you, then you will be virtuous and powerful. That's what I myself take it principally to mean. Okay. Oh. How did this happen? Sorry. Yeah. So we don't have much time left for this class today, but I'm going to just brief, and especially since I wanted to, I've already gone almost 15 minutes over on lectures to this point, so I was going to try to make up for that by having a slightly shorter couple of lectures. But I do want to introduce some of the ways in which Taoism is a response to or is critical of ru shui, some of the specific things, and a little of the way it's critical of legalism, though again the Han Feizi and so on, those crucial texts of legalism post-date. They follow the Dàodéjīng. So the Dàodéjīng is not referring specifically to those texts, but it's clear that they're responding to tendencies that subsequently manifest themselves in legalism. Okay, so one scholar writing on the Dàodéjīng says, quote, one of its primary themes is an opposition to learning, cultural knowledge, and morality, all of which are dismissed as unnatural and therefore contrary to the way. And many of these critiques seem aimed directly at the teachings of the Analects. It's actually really striking. There are passages, I'm hoping that you'll see when you read them, that if you had read them like 2 months ago, you would have understood them completely differently because you wouldn't have seen their relation to ru shui. And now you will see that relation. Slingerhand, I'm also obviously agreeing with Slingerhand, who's far more of a scholar on Dàoism than I am. No comparison. But I'm obviously agreeing with him that he isn't talking about Wu Wei here, but what I said about Wu Wei is consistent with what he's saying here. That what I said was that doing nothing is primarily allowing nature, which is to say the Tao, to act through you. And it's all of these artificial things that turn you away from behaving naturally, allowing the Tao to guide you. It's all of those things that the Dàodéjīng is objecting to. Okay, so now we go back to our C text and go to Dàoism and the Dàodéjīng. And I usually begin with the first one, but maybe, since I hadn't counted on taking this amount of time, I'm going to go to 18 first, just so I give you an idea of the sort of intensity of the anti-ru shui orientation of much Taoism. It actually is almost mean in what it says about ru shui. So, verse 18 of the Dàodéjīng. When the great Tao ceased to be observed, benevolence and righteousness came into vogue. Then appeared wisdom and shrewdness, and then ensued great hypocrisy. When harmony no longer prevailed throughout the six kinships, filial sons found their manifestation. When the states and clans fell into disorder, loyal ministers appeared. I'm just like speechless at the harshness of this judgment. So what does this passage say? The passage says that a long time ago, presumably at the time of the Yellow Emperor, presumably, or perhaps at the time of the Sage Kings, we had a utopian society. In that utopian society, the Tao prevailed. The Tao acted through people. People were natural. People did things in accordance with the Tao. And it was only because the Tao failed, because there was a falling off from this natural condition of virtue. It was only because of this falling off that people began to talk about Ren and righteousness. Again, the Ren is this character here, which is the primary virtue in Rushui. So rather than exactly the opposite of what Rushui says, rather than benevolence being the way, being the main manner, the main virtue that leads you on the way, what it is a degraded substitute for the great Tao, the way as taught in Dàoism. Excuse me. Okay, so then appeared wisdom and shrewdness, and there ensued great hypocrisy. So as soon as you got this advocacy of benevolence, which was, and righteousness or justice is another way of translating yi in the Chinese there. As soon as you got this substitute of Rushui, of rules of Rushui rather than people behaving naturally, then you started getting wisdom and shrewdness. So you get the wise teachings of Kongzi, which are characterized as shrewd, or perhaps another way of interpreting this is that the righteousness and the shrewdness go together with something like legalism. But I think mostly this passage is focused on Rushui, because clearly the benevolence, that's just a slap in the face of Rushui, and wisdom also. The result is great hypocrisy. So here the text is accusing the Rushui tradition of exactly the insincerity that the doctrine of the mean is advocating as central to the Rushui tradition. When harmony no longer prevailed throughout the six kinships, filial sons found their manifestation. So in the utopian society, when people naturally followed the Tao, then you didn't talk about filial piety. Filial piety is not the ideal. It's a falling off from the ideal. It's what happens when people are no longer naturally letting the Tao act. It's when they're no longer engaged in Wu Wei, but are engaged in Wei, which is to say action. When they're behaving, when they're intentionally undertaking to be good rather than achieving de or virtue simply naturally. And again, a slap in the face of Rushui by basically denouncing the emphasis on filiality, on Shao. And then the final blow comes when the states and clans fell into disorder, loyal ministers appeared. So in other words, loyal ministers aren't the way that you achieve a good unified society. Rather, talk about loyal ministers is itself just a symptom of the disintegration of society. It's disintegration due to the drifting away from the Tao and the engagement in activity rather than Wu Wei, non-action, natural non-action. And of course, this fits perfectly well with, historically, with the development of Rushui, first in the spring and autumn period, and then in the Warring States period, when exactly such a social disintegration had occurred. Okay, so we'll pick up on this and continue on to Zhuangzi next time. Thank you.